the message after the tone.
Something on your mind? Leave Ron a message at 805-2-INSANA.
And welcome back to the Insana Quotient. I'm Ron Insana here on IQ Radio. You know, sometimes big businesses make some unsustainable mistakes that can, in fact, be preventable with a little bit of forethought. And joining us now to talk about that is Jeff Muscarella. He is managing partner at NPI Financial, responsible for leading a practice that helps clients achieve world-class information technology spending. And he's been focusing his efforts lately on some of the mistakes that big companies make and how they might be avoided. Jeff, thanks for being with us. Appreciate your coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Ron.
First off, if you would just familiarize our listeners with why we're focused here on IT spending as really as a mechanism by which companies can avoid costly errors.
Certainly, and IT spending is really just one of the areas. But as we've seen in the news lately, lots of companies have been driving direct costs down for years now, and I think they've gotten to the point where there just isn't any more fat to cut off the bone. When you look at things like labor costs with companies like Foxconn in Asia, you look at cutting things like safety with respect to BP or Toyota, clearly we've reached a point that's unsustainable in making further cuts. And one area that companies tend to overlook, in our experience a lot, is indirect costs. So things like technology, transportation, energy. Sometimes these have become sacred cows in corporations' budgets, and if people really are willing to roll up their sleeves and take a new look at those, they can drive a lot of cost out of their purchasing, their spending, things that just are really tucked away and people don't normally see.
Now, what's the easiest way in which to identify those areas? I mean, we've in the past here and elsewhere talked about enterprise solutions that would enhance a company's productivity or help to enhance their profitability. What's the way in which corporations can use information technology to do what you just described?
Well, one of the newest things that we're seeing in the marketplace is really beginning to hold, in the case of information technology, the suppliers and vendors accountable for the promises that they make about what their technology will do. So, for example, a hot new area of business spending is still on business intelligence or analytics. And many projects we've worked on with clients, we're now seeing those suppliers of those types of solutions step up to the plate and guarantee business returns for the project, as well as just traditional warranties and guarantees on their workmanship. So that's kind of an interesting change when you see that they're going to help make sure that marketing programs that are driven by perhaps website logging tools and data analytics tools are actually, if you don't see the return on investment that was guaranteed on the front end with the business case, then they're going to be held accountable and their fees will go down accordingly.
Now, what about these unsustainable mistakes that you talk about? In your mind, which are among the most important?
Clearly the ones we've seen in this economy has really been jobs. We've seen so many of our clients and prospects continue to cut jobs because it just seems to be one of the quickest and most effective ways to immediately turn the ship, no matter how large it is. But, as we've seen, as we mentioned, in certain areas, I think, that's starting to have an impact on quality of products as well as safety. And those are just, unacceptable. E. coli in our food, all of those things are what we consider to be unsustainable cost-cutting solutions. And what we advise clients to do is look for ways to drive sustainable cost-cutting, and that is looking, as we said, in many of these indirect spend areas, technology, transportation, your contracts with your suppliers, beginning to take a more holistic approach to how you manage your suppliers. As companies outsource more these days and live in a multinational world, many of the revenue dollars that come in the top line go right out the door again to different partners. And so you really need to be managing all of those costs well in your supply chain in order not to be overspending by millions or hundreds of millions.
Yeah, now you identify kind of the three Ps of the new normal, and the new normal is a description of the economy promulgated by Bill Gross of PIMCO, that we are going to see slower than average growth for quite some time to come. But your three Ps are people, profits, and the planet. Now, in an environment like this, where, as you say, the fastest way to cut costs and build up what is now a record cash hoard for American corporations of about $2 trillion, people are the first to go, and it seems that corporations, given the numerous uncertainties, are reluctant to hire people back on a full-time basis. How do you get them focused on the fact that people are actually an asset more often than they are a liability?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of times when we come into organizations, we begin by going through, their initial spending. And when you begin to put things in perspective of what is an industry average or norm for labor cost, and match that up against other things which have been hard to identify before, meaning what isn't a reasonable amount to spend on technology? What is a reasonable amount to spend on transportation for a given industry or a given process? That data has not been easily available. Labor stats have been around for years, but spending on indirect cost has not been. And then, of course, there's always the what numbers go into those numbers. Are they valid? But when you really begin to look at it from that perspective, you begin to see that in terms of the return on your investment, your people costs are not quite as high as you tend to think, and there's some other numbers that typically shock, CEOs and other high-level executives. And that's where you want to start.
Yeah. Now, what makes them, though, sometimes reject the data that they get back that may, in fact, be very solid with respect to what you just described?
Well, that's an interesting question. A lot of times it comes down to, unfortunately, as we mentioned, kind of sacred cows or just a belief that isn't really backed up by fact that they're already doing all they can in those areas. And a lot of times people are unwilling to believe that, their agreements with suppliers may not be as effective as they could be, or that they're not holding them accountable the way they should be. I think every one of us that gets involved in purchasing something in our lives likes to think that we've done a good job with that. And so sometimes it's difficult for folks to take a step back and say, let's re-examine those agreements with our key suppliers. Let's look for ways to reduce costs and ensure return on investment and get innovative. Yeah.
Now, as many people know, I'm not a climate change hysteric or global warming freak, even though it's 110 degrees in New York right now. But that aside, you do talk about the planet and you talk about sustainability. And a little over a year or so ago, I was having a private conversation with former President Clinton, and he was in the process of helping to green the Empire State Building, and described to me and a colleague how quickly there would be cost savings associated with this, and how quickly the enterprise would pay for itself to make a building like the Empire State Building more energy efficient. And regardless of, I guess, your feelings about or beliefs about global warming, I mean, at the end of the day, some of this is just good business. Whether it's good environmental stewardship might even be a separate question, but some companies embrace it, some companies reject it. Even though it could save them, quite frankly, a ton of money.
Absolutely, and I think one of the key changes going on there is, I think, finally the technology to help consume less power, do things in a more green and planet-friendly way are becoming real. And there's still a lot of rightly so assessment and study of whether or not the return on the investment is there for those improvements. But I think we're finally hitting that point where, in many cases, they are, and so you constantly have to go back through that old laundry list of things that maybe were tried in the the 80s or 90s and didn't quite have the payoff that you wanted, and revisit them.
And in many cases, from what I understand, I mean, energy costs for a large commercial office building or something like that can go down as much as 40% with the proper controls put in place to deal with just the fact that HVAC management it was so inefficient, but now there are ways of heating and cooling portions of the building in a manner that is much more efficient and much more kind of time sensitive than it's been in the past.
Absolutely, and even in those areas, you see such simple things as duct work that's leaking and a lot of stuff that can be labor intensive to go back and review and improve, but once again, there's an example of where if you invest in that cost, you're going to reap, 10 times the return on investment, and then those dollars can be used for strategic growth in the business, innovation and creating products and services that we all want.
Now, we mentioned profits, and corporations, as we said, are sitting, non-financial corporations are sitting on a cash hoard now approaching $2 trillion. They don't see end-user demand to hire back people. They don't see end-user demand necessarily to expand their plant and equipment spending. And yet they have been spending, it seems, on information technology, which seems to be one of the strongest areas in the economy today. Is that the sense that you're getting?
We are beginning to see quite a bit more spending on IT. And it's one of those areas, though, where the buyer always has to beware. You have to be examining the cost of those products and services because, quite frankly, in our work, we often see that people overpay for technology.
All right, Jeff, we're going to have to leave it there. I apologize for cutting off. Jeff Muscarella of NPI Financial. When we come back, a little